Hi, everybody. It's Russ Kensier with the National Floor Safety Institute, here with another training program that actually is based on a question that I'm asked quite a bit. And that is, Russ, slips, trips, and falls seem to be a very complex problem. A lot of moving parts, a lot of variables. What is it that we can do quickly and easily to begin the process of turning the tide on our slip and fall problem? Can you give us some tips? So today's program is entitled Solving Your Slip, Trip, and Fall Problem in 5 Easy Steps. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. So you have a slip and fall problem or a trip and fall problem, and you're confused, not certain what you need to do, how to approach your issues, and again, you may have called on other resources, you may have read some books or talked to safety people, and well, at the end of the day, you're confused. So we're going to help you solve your problem in your business. And to begin doing that, we have to identify what are those 5 key ingredients that pretty much play a role in everybody's slip, trip, and fall problem. As many of you know, I've written a series of books. Falls Aren't Funny is one of the best sellers that I've written. But many of you may not know the history of the National Floor Safety Institute. We were started back in 1997. I was one of the founders as a 501c3 charitable organization. We have a very simple mission, and that is to aid in the prevention of slips, trips, and falls through education, training, and research. We also author the national standards for walkway safety here in the United States under the NFSI B101 Standards Developing Committee. So many of you may know something about NFSI, but you may not know that we're actually led by a 15-member board of directors representing a wide range of industries. We have quite a few different stakeholders, including manufacturers, risk managers, insurance companies, several lawyers. In fact, we have the former head of OSHA on our board of directors. And so we have a very diverse background in terms of representation on the NFSI board of directors, and everybody has a voice. And it's important that they do, because after all, solving the slip, trip, and fall problem is more than just a single approach. It takes a lot of different viewpoints to really be effective. With that, we start with the slip and fall safety pyramid. Many of you have perhaps seen this in the past for different industries, but in the world of slip, trip, and fall prevention, for every slip and fall fatality, you're going to have 23 people fall and report an injury or an incident. And then 70 people will fall and will go unreported. And so if you're having a number of incidents taking place that you're recording, keep in mind you probably have 3 times as many people falling that you don't really know about. Now, any one of them could turn into a claim or could turn into a much more serious injury, even a fatality. So what's going on? What are the elements influencing the fall management process, as it's called? And this was information that was published by Liberty Mutual Insurance a number of years ago. But as you can see from this diagram, the problem associated with prevention of falls, the various elements are diverse. You start with management or leadership at the top of the graph, the circle. That's kind of the culture of the organization. Do they have a successful pro-safety culture? If so, that gets passed down from senior management via training to the employees, kind of going clockwise around the graph. You'll find that many companies will provide incident or surveillance of their walking surfaces of their building to see if they can find or watch people that may be slipping and falling or incurring some type of injury. So many businesses have surveillance video primarily for safety purposes, but really it's for cops and robbers stuff, or security, catching people who are shoplifting or stealing, or maybe committing some type of crime. You then have hazard surveillance, looking out for, in this case, wet floors or spills that may have occurred and that go unannounced. How your floor was selected makes a big difference. I spend a lot of time talking to architects and designers about putting in the right floor. And of course, as we go around the curve, cleaning and maintaining that floor. In fact, cleaning is just as important in preventing slips, trips, and falls as the floor itself. We go around the curve to find slip-resistant footwear. Obviously, that's for employees. You cannot make your invited guests wear any particular type of shoe. And in fact, they will wear all types of shoes in your environment, but you can control the footwear of your employees. And we're going to talk about that a little later. Using floor mats. Well, first of all, what type of mat are you using? How are you using it? How many? And how are you caring for them? How are you actually inspecting your floor mats to make sure they're not buckled or curled or have some other type of hazardous condition that can happen very quickly? Floor slip resistance or slipperiness assessment. Are you testing your floor's coefficient of friction? How do you know that your floors are safe unless you test them? And many of you may not be testing in fear of litigation. Oftentimes attorneys will say to me, well, we instruct our clients not to test their floors because, well, if they find a problem, that's discoverable in a lawsuit. Well, my view is let's prevent the lawsuit by preventing the injury because you tested the floor and found that there was a hazardous condition and you took quick action to make the floor safe. The last part of the curve deals with warning signs and instructions. Are you posting wet floor signs? Are you barricading areas that have a high level of risk, especially when they're wet? And if you're not, well, you need to. The reason for barricading, of course, is to prevent entry in an area that you know is hazardous. Don't assume people are going to simply stop and walk around it if they see a wet floor sign. You need to prevent entry. And so the elements in influencing or affecting slips, trips, and falls can be summarized in this particular graph. Many of you may be asking a more simple question, and that is, what actually are the causes of slips and falls? And as you see on this graph, about 50% of all falls are caused by the floor. The unsafe condition of the floor is the leading cause of accidental injury. 24%, the second leading cause, is footwear. Again, you can't control your guest's footwear, but you can control your workers' footwear. So if you were just able to better manage your floor's safety, meaning the selection of your floor and the maintenance of your floor, and get the right types of shoes on your employees' feet, you could potentially solve up to 74% of your current slip and fall problem. The last three pieces of the pie chart deal with fraud, hazard identification, again, that deals with wet floor signs, and training. Don't let fraud mislead you. The vast majority of slip and fall claims are legitimate. Very, very few are considered fraudulent, and fraud comes in all different shapes and sizes. Many people that would fraudulently claim a slip and fall may have had a legitimate fall, but may be embellishing the severity of their injury, thinking they'll kind of have a big payout. But very few people will intentionally hurt themselves and create a fraudulent claim than you would think. In fact, the insurance industry estimates the total number of fraudulent claims for slips, trips, and falls to be less than 5%. So the next time you see a surveillance video news story on your local news channel, keep in mind that there's for every fraudulent event taking place on surveillance video, there's 20 legitimate slip and fall or trip and fall events that you don't really see on the media. But it does play into the public's perception of slips and falls being not a big deal, really just a matter of the insurance industry to manage fraud. And the attorneys that represent these folks are just, frivolous lawsuits, are ambulance chasers. The fact of the matter is, it couldn't be further from the truth. And we're going to talk about that as well. But let's take a close look at who actually is falling. The average victim of a slip, trip, and fall is an older person over the age of 60, baby boomer. The average cost per claim, depending on industry, of course, it might vary, is about $12,800. So they're very expensive. And by the way, that doesn't include settlements or lawsuits or lawyers. That's just processing a claim. It's an expensive process. It's not unusual for litigation costs to top $100,000. And since 1980, jury verdicts and lawsuits in general have significantly increased. But the problem is really associated with the elderly. And today we have 10,000 baby boomers retiring today, each day. And we find that these are people that are very active. They're shopping, they're vacationing, they're out and about. And so with every step they take, there's a higher likelihood that one might result in a slip or a trip, only to result in a claim or possibly even a fatality. The NFSI B101 Committee on Slip, Trip, and Fall Prevention has published a number of standards. You'll see the B101.0 walkway auditing standard all the way through the B101.10 standard, which deals with some technical matters involving calibration and management of sensor materials for tribometers. But there's a wide range of standards that are published by the NFSI B101 committee, and we're going to spend a little bit of time going through them. The ones that you see in yellow are already published. B101.0, the walkway auditing guideline. .1, the wet SCOF standard, that stands for static coefficient of friction. The wet DCOF standard, that's dynamic coefficient of friction. B101.3. The B101.4 standard is currently in its final stretch for approval. That's a standard that is extremely in demand. That's for wet barefoot conditions, people that are bathing or showering, bathtubs, showers, swimming pool decks, boat decks, ramps, any place that people would be expected to be walking under wet barefoot conditions, that standard is going to address. Again, it's not published yet. The remaining standards that you see in gold or yellow are already published, a labeling standard, floor mat standards, etc. And then the last three deal with, as I mentioned, tribometer, sensor preparation as a technical standard, inclement weather, the B101.11. And then lastly, the B101 committee is working on a warning signs standard. So stay tuned. There's a lot of very, very valuable standards published and several more on the way. A number of years ago, CNA Insurance did a study which they entitled Measuring the Risk of Slips and Falls, an Injury Reduction Study using tribometry. Tribometry is a fancy term for testing of floors. The slip resistance of floors or coefficient of friction of floors can be tested. And this study was, again, done a number of years ago. And what CNA, one of the largest insurers for workers' compensation insurance, wanted to identify or find is, what's going on? Can we actually measure the coefficient of friction of a floor, of a walkway, and connect that, correlate that to a slip and fall claim, or an increased level of claims or a decreased level of claims? So CNA sought to use a wet static coefficient of friction test method, the NFSI B101.1 method, and they see it as a risk management tool. Measuring the performance of a floor's slip resistance will provide insight into the safety of that particular walkway, and of course that relates to injury claims. The predictive analytics that CNA focused on was such that they collected they went into 362 franchised restaurants over a 3-year period, of which 112 of them had what they called tribometry service. They were actually testing the floors in 112 out of the 362 restaurants. The on-site testing, again, was done per the NFSI ANSI B101.1 standard, which dates back to 2009 when the NFSI was an ANSI standards developer. Today, we are no longer affiliated with ANSI. NFSI publishes standards on their own. And they use a device called the BOT 3000. Not the BOT 3000E, that's a completely different device made by a different company, but the BOT 3000, which today is known as the TrackScan, or more recently, the TrackScan 2.0. So that was the device they used. That is an NFSI-approved tribometer. And so what they found is about a third of their floors that they were testing in these restaurants were high traction, 34% in fact. A remaining 45%, 48% were moderate traction, and then the remainder were low traction, roughly 18%. So if you look at this grid, what CNA found is in the restaurant industry, the majority of the floors that are in a restaurant were either moderate or low traction, and only 34% were high traction. High traction, of course, means that particular floor, even when wet, will present a lower risk of a slip and fall. But did it? Did high traction floors really outperform the other categories of flooring, moderate and low? And can that be measured? Can you actually track incident reports? And so the analysis that was done found that of all the claims that CNA was seeing out of those 112 stores, only 13% were on floors that were high traction. In fact, the majority of claims were on moderate traction floors, about 58%. And so what kind of jumped out was the fact that 87% of claims in a restaurant can be prevented by simply elevating the coefficient of friction of the floor, of the walkway, to the high traction range. And so only 13% of claims were taking place on high traction floors. So the goal is to make your floors high traction, and you're going to see a significant decrease in injury claims. As the traction levels go down, moderate to low traction, the risk goes up. And so you can actually measure risk of a slip and fall by measuring the traction of the floor per the NFSI B101.1 or the NFSI B101.3 standards. So 87% of slip and fall claims occurred on moderate to low traction floors, only 13% on high traction floors. If you look at the graph, that little piece of the pie pays big dividends. Keeping that floor safer really makes a big difference as it comes to insurance claims. And of course, claims can be small and claims can be very, very big. They can lead to litigation and significant losses, especially if that particular lawsuit goes to trial and the plaintiff prevails. If the plaintiff wins, it's not unusual to see jury verdicts in the millions of dollars. And so the cost associated with the exposure of lower traction floors can certainly be offset by using higher traction floors. It's a lot less expensive to make your floors high traction, meaning keeping them clean, putting the right floors in, etc., than it is paying these claims, let alone lawsuits. The study's recommendations were threefold. First, select high traction, slip resistant flooring materials when you build the building, when you construct the building. Each of these products that we see here today that are considered high traction are readily available. Most architects and designers have access to a wide range of flooring materials. Select those that are high traction. And for more guidance, go to the NFSI website, and you can actually see the products that have been tested and certified by the National Floor Safety Institute. But if you don't see a particular product on our website, and there's, I think, several hundred, don't worry. You can always submit your product to an independent testing lab, including the NFSI, and they'll be happy to test your product for you and let you know whether or not it is a high traction surface. You need to know what that out-of-box slip resistance value is. Sadly, most manufacturers of flooring don't tell you how slippery their floors are. They don't test their products' coefficient of friction, nor do they uniformly label their products. So depending on resilient floors, ceramic tile floors, wood floors, polished concrete, we can go all the way down the list. You really oftentimes don't know just how slippery or safe or unsafe that product is unless you demand that the manufacturer provide that to you. So we encourage you to do that. And then lastly, selecting the right cleaning products. How you clean the floor makes a big difference. You can start out with a high traction floor, but due to improper maintenance, meaning using chemicals that might leave a slippery film or not remove built up soils, that high traction floor can degrade pretty quickly, especially when wet. And so you want to make sure you select the right floor and the right cleaning procedures. The rate of slipping, according to CNA, decreased by 21% for every 0.1 increase in the kitchen's mean coefficient of friction. And remember, the coefficient of friction ranges between 0 and 1. And so a value of 0.4, 0.41, 0.42 would indicate, that second decimal would indicate that percentage increase in exposure. So there is a difference between a 0.45 and a 0.44 and a 0.43. Not that it's always critical, but there is a measurable difference associated to injury claims or insurance claims between these various ranges. And so pay attention to the coefficient of friction values that you're collecting in your environment. And by the way, they'll range. You can test in one part of your building and come up with numbers that may be a little bit different or significantly different than another part of your building. So it's important that you take measurements and you collect that data and you manage your slip and fall problem. Collecting data is the key. And that's not just my opinion, but that's been proved with the CNA study. And again, in this particular case where they just tested restaurants, the coefficient of friction in the restaurants that they tested ranged between a 0.45, which is high traction, and 0.86, which is very high traction. So they had a very big range. And that kind of revealed a 15-fold increase in the rate of slipping. So when employees were working on a contaminated or wet floor, which occurred during 1/3 of their work time, that would expose, if you will, a higher risk of a slip and fall. So the higher the traction, the lower the risk. And they actually measured that. That was an effective measurement by the study. So step one, use high traction floors tested either under the NFSI B101.1 or B101.3 wet decoff standard. The NFSI B101.3 standard is very popular. A lot of companies use it. It's a very convenient way to test floors. We're going to be talking about that in a minute. And so that's the key. Start testing your floors. So the NFSI B101.3 standard scope states that this test method specifies both the procedures and the devices, otherwise known as tribometers, to test floors either in a laboratory or in the field. And again, we're measuring dynamic coefficient of friction for hard surface floors. Those are ceramic, marble, wood, etc. The application portion of the standard states that the method does not apply to carpeting or any types of soft materials, but rather most of the common hard surface floors like stone, vinyl, those types of things. So there is an application that you need to keep in mind. It does not apply to carpeting, but it does apply to most hard surface floors. The NFSI B101.3 standard was actually based on the European DIN 51131 standard, which was based on German research dating back, I think, 30 or so years ago. And so that served as the root of the B101.3 standard, meaning there's been a lot of research that went into the development of the standard. And it's important that you understand that because that research pays big dividends. Table 1 of the NFSI B101.3 standard breaks traction ranges down, as I mentioned a moment ago, into 3 ranges. High traction that has a wet dynamic coefficient of friction of 0.45 or greater. Moderate traction, which has a dynamic coefficient of friction value ranging between 0.30 and 0.44. And then the lowest level, the highest risk, is what's known as low traction. Those have dynamic coefficient of friction values less than 0.3. High traction floors have been clinically proven based on NFSI research and other publications that have been published in peer-reviewed standards, as well as industry trade association publications, have demonstrated that you can prevent slip and fall claims by up to 90% by using a high traction surface and maintaining the floor in a high traction state. And so 90% of all slip and fall claims can be prevented by simply having high traction floors. The next thing we're going to talk about is how these devices work. This is the TrackScan 2.0. It's the latest version of the BOT 3000, which was and is manufactured in Germany. And as you can see, the device is very simple. You simply put it on the ground, you press a button, and it's measuring the static coefficient of friction. Once the device is done taking its 5 samples, you'll see on the graphic display the value, 0.87. That was the average value of this particular floor, which is high traction. The TrackScan 2 can also measure dynamic coefficient of friction. And that's where the device simply walks all the way along the floor in one steady path and will produce a dynamic value, in this case, 0.56. So this particular floor had a high traction SCOF range and a moderate traction DCOF range. The device will print the data out or store it for future use. So it's really a handy way to really manage your data. Again, there are 3 devices, tribometers, that the National Floor Safety Institute has certified or approved. The first one is the TrackScan and the TrackScan 2.0. The second one is the GS1. And then thirdly is the American Slip Meter Model 825, which measures SCOF, and the ASM 925, which measures dynamic coefficient of friction. Many of you are probably finding some level of concern or problem with exterior painted ramps or steps, curbs, areas outside of your building that you're finding people are slipping or tripping on, here's a good example of how to address exterior slips or trips. Paint the edges of elevated surfaces like curbs or steps in bright yellow so people can see them, both in going up the stairs and descending the stairs. A little bit of yellow paint could make a big difference in identifying where that edge of that drop-off is, especially at night, and especially for the elderly, which oftentimes have a difficult time recognizing the edge of a step or a drop-off or a curb, only to result in a serious injury. Also, use an appropriate size aggregate when you're going to paint a surface. Aggregate meaning like a sand, and there's different types of aggregate material, some that are larger size and some that are smaller size, more of a finer sand. But when you add the right type of aggregate to your painted surface, it's going to increase the coefficient of friction. So even when it's wet, and by the way, you can't control the weather, so exterior walkways that you're painting are going to get wet, it will provide that cushion, that additional benefit of slip resistance under wet conditions and prevent the slip and fall. What you see in the photograph here is a ADA compliant ramp that they painted in bright blue. There's a red line that's from the fire code. The fire department requires red is a no parking area. And so if you're going to paint, use an aggregate in the paint. If not, if you don't want to paint, that's fine too. Just make sure that the substrate, the concrete is a broom finish. It's a rough finish. But again, painting edges, changes in elevations can go a long way in preventing injuries. Here's another good example. Lady on a day that it just had rained was running across the sidewalk to get to her car, and down she went on a painted surface. The ramp was painted in a red kind of an epoxy paint, and they did not have an aggregate material in it. And so as she was kind of jogging across the paint, going down, well, she fell, and that resulted in a serious injury. It's common. It's very common. And the solution is inexpensive, and it's simple. And so we encourage you to take control of your exterior walkways by just making sure they have an adequate level of traction. If you're going to paint, use an aggregate, or if you're not going to paint, that's fine too. Just paint those changes and elevations. Step 2, selecting the right floor cleaning product. Boy, this is a complex problem. And let's be honest, cleaning floors is not fun. It's a dirty job. Improper floor maintenance directly correlates to slips, trips, and falls. Having floors that are soiled, specifically with oil or other types of substances, can create a slip hazard, especially when wet. And so selecting the right floor cleaner is just as important as selecting the right floor. As I mentioned a moment ago, having a high traction floor doesn't necessarily mean that you don't have to worry about slips and falls. If you're not maintaining it properly, it's going to get slippery. And so they go hand in hand. Use the right floor, use the right cleaning procedure. If from time to time you want to provide a periodic safety treatment, that's also a good idea. And you'll see a list of those on the NFSI website under the certified product section. Another problem that's common in some industries, like the food industry, the restaurant industry, are what are known as polymerized films. These are films that build up over time, and they're a combination of oil and fat and food, mineral deposits, and soap film that over time kind of build up this wax-like surface. When you look at a floor, you'll oftentimes see that, gee, it looks a little bit shiny. Well, in this case that you see on the screen, there's 2 quarry tile floors. And quarry tile, which is commonly used in restaurants, when it's new is dull. It doesn't have a shine. So the reason why these floors are shiny is because there's something on them that's reflecting light. Now, for many people, they think, well, gosh, that looks great. The floor looks shiny, and shiny means clean, and our customers like that look. Well, it may look clean, but it's not clean. And in fact, it's usually quite dangerous, and you can actually measure just how slippery these types of floors are under a polymerized film quickly. Here's an example of a quarry tile floor magnified under a scanning electron microscope at 1600 power. As you see, the surface is very, very rough. Looks like a mountain range, a high level of traction. But just over a short period of time, that those mountain ranges kind of get filled in with soil, with soap films, these polymerized films. And you can see them in the front and the foreground of this photograph. That wax-like material builds up, and it's hard to remove those. You need to have a specialized safety treatment to pull that polymerized film off the top of the floor. Here's a good example of a real-world polymerized film slip and fall. Customer approaching the counter, slips and falls on a section of the floor that had a polymerized film known that came out later. This was a lawsuit. And the floor was wet. She slipped and fell. And as you can see, she severely injured her left knee. In fact, she fractured her patella. Very, very serious injury. This could have been easily prevented by simply maintaining the floor in the dining room in the high traction level. In 2006, the National Floor Safety Institute published a study on household floor cleaners and how did they stack up when it came to slip resistance. We were trying to identify, were some floor cleaning products working better than others? Were some floor cleaners perhaps leaving a slippery film than others? And we wanted to know. And so the study revealed that most of the most common household floor cleaners back then actually made the floor more slippery after mopping than before mopping. The worst of the crowd was Murphy's oil soap, which after just a couple of mopping cycles reduced the coefficient of friction by almost 60%. Now, that's not intuitive. Most people think that the more you mop the floor, the safer it gets. Well, the fact of the matter is, if you're using a cleaning product that leaves a soap film behind, because most people don't rinse their floors, well, that soap film builds up and over time creates a very slippery condition that when it becomes wet, becomes a lubricant, and that's going to lead to a high number of slips and falls. So just because a product is sold both commercially and through the retail stores, don't assume that it necessarily is going to perform particularly well in terms of slip resistance. Many of the most common household floor cleaners make floors slippery, and that increases the risk of somebody slipping and falling while using or after using these products in their home. So how do you know if a product is performing well? Again, look for the NFSI high traction logo. This is your guarantee that the product's been designed to work and will perform in such a way as not to create a polymerized film. It's not going to leave a soap film. It's not going to leave a combination of soap and mineral deposits that will also work together to reduce the coefficient of friction. In order for a product to be certified, it has to increase the coefficient of friction by 20% or more, meaning the cleaning product, when used on a soiled floor, has to increase the coefficient of friction by 20%. Regular tap water oftentimes will increase the slip resistance, or just more frequent mopping in general with clear water will over time increase the performance because you're removing the soap film. But in order for a chemical cleaning product or safety treatment to garnish the NFSI certified logo as high traction, it must meet a minimum threshold of a 20% increase in terms of coefficient of friction performance. Step 3, properly select and maintain and use, I would add, floor matting. Floor mats are very commonly used at building entrances, and they play an important role. Here's an example of a hazard that was created because there was no floor mat. Rainy day, floors getting wet because people are migrating water on their shoes. You take your first step into the store, the restaurant, and it may result in a slip and fall. So here's an example of how having a floor mat at the entranceway would actually contain the water. It wouldn't be pooling up. And that, of course, lends itself towards not only keeping the building clean, but also keeping the building or the entranceway dry. Dry floors are safer than wet floors. However, entranceway matting is oftentimes a leading cause of trips and falls. So as you're trying to prevent a slip and fall, you may be creating a trip hazard. For example, floor mats are oftentimes buckled. They'll have this edge buckle or buckle going directly down the middle of the floor mat because oftentimes these floor mats or rental mats are rolled up by the company that's delivering them. And then when they unroll the mat, it'll have this buckle in it from from the shape that it had when it was rolled up. And so if you see a mat that has a buckle, that's a trip hazard. That's an easy opportunity for somebody to get the toe of their shoe or flip-flop, sandal, right underneath that mat as to cause them to trip and fall. And so buckled mats are a big problem. Another problem is what's called baconing. When you see the edge of the mat has all these shallow ripples, that oftentimes is a material defect. That mat is defective. You can't fix that problem. And so these are mats that shouldn't be at the entranceway because they create a trip hazard. Every one of those little ripples is an opportunity for someone to get the toe of their shoe caught in as to cause them to trip and fall and get hurt. Another problem that oftentimes is associated with floor mats is laying floor mats over changes in elevation or putting a floor mat over an electrical cord. Floor mats are not intended to be used to cover electrical cords or to provide some camouflage for changes in elevation. So somebody walking across the mat that you see here on the slide may not realize that there's this change in elevation. There's a step up and stub their toe right where that change in elevation is beneath the mat because the mat really camouflaged it, made it hard to see. How often do you see this? Boy, I see it all the time. Curled corners of mats. These are mats that have been in the field too long. They're worn out. They've aged. They're defective. They need to be thrown away. But yet you see it all the time where the corner of the mat just rolls up. Needless to say, that's a trip hazard. And again, this is a problem that didn't happen overnight. This is something that took a while for the floor mat to develop this curled corner. And once identified, it needs to be disposed of. It's a lot less expensive to replace a $30 to $40 mat than to pay a $12,800 injury claim. Here's a good example of just that. Lady coming into the bank, the front of the mat had buckled and it caused her to catch the toe of her shoe, falling forwards. She was entering the bank with her son, and that resulted in a very, very serious injury, one that could easily have been prevented had the floor mat been inspected and removed from service because it had a buckle. Don't overlap mats. Another problem. A lot of retailers think, well, gee, if one mat's good, two's got to be better. And so they'll put mats on top of mats, across mats. Every time you do that, you create an opportunity for somebody to catch the toe of their shoe on that edge of the mat as to create an injury. So if you want to cover a large area with mats, use one large mat, one big mat, versus two or three smaller side mats. Here's another example of just that problem. Lady's leaving a convenience store. She catches the toe of her shoe on the edge of a runner. If you notice, that mat is what's known as a runner. It's a very wide mat and narrow. It's actually laid the wrong way. Runners are meant to be laid lengthwise, meaning you have more distance to remove soil or moisture. But again, this was an improperly installed mat, one that had a ripple or a curl on the edge, and she tripped right over it. By the grace of God, she didn't go through the door, but that easily could have happened. How often do you see mats used as what I call islands of safety? Kind of hopscotch, a mat next to a mat next to a mat. And you say to yourself when you go into, in this case, a restaurant, they must obviously have a slippery floor problem. Because if they didn't, why are they putting all these mats down? What do these mats do other than present a slip hazard? And by the way, these mats will oftentimes slide on the floor, like surfboards, when the floor beneath the mat is wet, which again is common. And so once you see mat after mat after mat, that tells you they've got a floor problem. Their floor is slippery. And instead of addressing the floor issue, they're kind of taking this Band-Aid approach to putting mats down. Another common problem, using the wrong type of mat for the wrong application. Drainage mats. What you see in this photograph is a drainage mat. It's a mat that has holes in it. It's designed to drain. And so this is normally used in a kitchen environment of a restaurant where you have workers standing on a mat cooking or standing on this type of a mat washing dishes. And the moisture, the water that's coming off the dishwashers, landing on the floor, but going through the holes of the mat as to provide the worker a level of safety, a margin of safety. But this very same mat, it does the opposite when it's put in front of an ice machine or a drink station. Because you think about it, you're going to discharge ice. Some of it may fall on the mat. It's going to go into the little holes of the mat and it's going to melt. And now the back of the mat is wet. And when this mat is wet on its backing, it again acts like a surfboard. And so it's just the wrong type of mat for the wrong type of application. But again, you see this quite often. Yet another example. Here's an example where this mat being laid in a doorway, electric doorway, this presents a trip hazard to every single person that's coming and going out of this building. So by the grace of God, somebody may or may not fall, trip over it, but this is an accident ready to happen. And again, you see the mat stuck in the door. And so the door is not properly opening and closing. And when the door does attempt to close, it creates this buckle in the mat. So the more this mat goes unattended, the more likely it's going to become damaged, and the more likely it's going to be correlated to a slip and fall, or in this case, a trip and fall event. Again, you see the water in the foreground. That's troubling that you have water pooling in front of the door, because it shouldn't. Most of the time, buildings are designed where water will sheet away from the door. It'll drain away from the door. In fact, the building code requires that. But we've got some problems here, and they go unattended. Another issue is inadequate length of entranceway matting. I mean, you don't have enough length. The mat's too small. Here's an example of a big box retailer where a lady comes in, and the mat was saturated because it had rained earlier in the day. And so she took water off of the mat onto the sole of her shoe. And the first step resulted in an injury. If you watch this closely, you'll see that she only took one step on the mat before she fell. Her left foot only contacted the mat one time, and that removed the moisture from the mat onto her shoe, kind of like an ink stamper. And that, of course, resulted in a broken patella, very serious injury. If you notice, there is a short orange safety cone to the left, kind of in the foreground here. We're going to be coming back to that a little bit later. And so although there was a warning sign, where she slipped and fell really didn't matter, because she didn't interpret the area or understand that the floor itself was that hazardous, and it led to a very serious injury. Another problem associated with mats, and I mentioned this earlier, is surfboarding. I oftentimes will go into a building and flip the mat over at the entranceway door just to see if it's wet beneath it, because it's common for floor mats to have water underneath them. Normally it's because they'll mop the floor the night before, and before the floor dries, they'll just throw the mats back down, and so the entire floor will dry everywhere except beneath the mat. And so somebody coming in or out of the building will step on the mat, and it's going to slide just like a surfboard, just like this gentleman did. As you see, he steps on the mat and the whole mat slides, and it resulted in him injuring his back. But notice the injury could have been prevented by simply keeping the floor beneath the mat dry. Something that simple. Step 4. Proper use of hazard warnings, wet floor signs, barricades, etc. First of all, here's how you don't use a wet floor sign. I don't understand quite what's going on here on the left. You have an orange traffic cone with a fold open, what's known as an A-frame wet floor sign draped over the top. That is certainly an unorthodox way of posting a warning. On the right, you see a wet floor sign actually used to prop open a door. Well, that's not how you use a wet floor sign. In fact, that wet floor sign may create a trip hazard, because somebody coming into this particular door may not recognize or be looking down to see the floor sign stuck underneath the door, because they're, again, looking forward, and trip over the wet floor sign. So the wet floor sign may actually be a trip hazard. How about this one? Is this a warning? Is this property owner, is this building trying to tell their pedestrians, their guests, that the floor is wet? Or is this just where they store the wet floor sign? Because it doesn't make a lot of sense what's going on in this particular application of a wet floor sign. You're going to ask the question, of course, well, Russ, what types of signs? What do I need to know about wet floor signs and the posting of wet floor signs? Well, number one, post signs, wet floor signs, caution signs in advance of the hazard. If the floor is wet, you want the warning signs to be in advance of where it's wet. You don't want people to be on the water or in a freshly mopped floor only to find the wet floor sign posted there. Give them some notice so they can walk around the area, so they can avoid the hazard. Place signs before you mop. Mop the floor after the signs have all been posted, and post them in a large enough area to contain the area you're mopping. Once the floor is mopped, dry the floor, remove the wet floor signs, and go to the next area. Signs should be at least 28 inches tall, meaning above knee length, because they're more visible. Signs that are shorter to the ground are oftentimes very difficult to see. And because they're very small, they're generally very lightweight. And so they move. We'll be talking about that in a minute. Barricades. If you have an area that has a large hazard, like a bathroom, a restroom in a facility, single entrance restroom, prop the door open, barricade the entry, mop the floor, let the floor dry, close the door, remove the barricade. You don't want people going into single entrance rooms like restrooms or break rooms with the floor being wet on the inside, because their first step they're going to take is going to most likely result in a slip. So use barricades when you have a large hazard, meaning a big area that's wet or hazardous, or single entrance rooms, as to alert people that, hey, there's a wet floor. But again, if you simply take the time to keep the floors dry after mopping, that goes a much longer way in preventing injuries. So use wet floor signs the way they're meant to be used. Again, barricading areas plays another important role in just ensuring that people cannot walk through or enter an area that's hazardous. Signs should also be heavy, as not to blow over or move, for example, with the wind. A lot of times these shorter, lightweight floor signs are used in a building's entrance. The door opens and the sign's blowing around. Storing the signs in the right location also makes a difference. You want to make sure that the signs aren't being perceived as being posted as to a warning, when in fact they're just being stored. And so where you store the signs and the type of signs you use goes a long way. So let's spend a little time talking about that orange sign that we saw in the previous. See how the sign's blowing around? The short sign actually moves. By the way, you notice the paramedics are now working on the lady who fractured her patella. But as the doors are opening, the sign is moving. It's blowing around. In fact, it's blowing away from the hazardous location. And so this should be a trigger for this particular property owner to stop using this type of sign, because it's ineffective. It simply doesn't work because it doesn't stay where you need it to stay. Posting a wet floor sign during mopping is not always enough. A lot of people think, well, as long as we have a wet floor sign out in the entranceway, that's all I have to worry about. I don't really have to do anything. Well, that's not necessarily true. Just posting a wet floor sign doesn't mean you're somehow indemnified from, a claim or somebody getting hurt. To suggest that, well, the wet floor sign was out, we told them that the floor was wet. Well, that's the first step. That's not every step. It's an important step, but it's just that. It's a single step. And so the first thing I recommend is don't mop floors at building entrances during times of high traffic. If you have people coming in, it's a high traffic time of day, don't mop the floor. Wait until the traffic goes down and then mop the floor in sections and dry the floor quickly so people aren't exposed to that wet floor hazard. Another good example of just that. Here's an individual mopping the floor at an entrance of a restaurant. And as you see, the wet floor signs are very far away. Actually, there's just one sign, very far away from the building's entrance, the opening. And as the person mopping the floor walks away from the area he just mopped, a guest came in and, yes, slipped and fell. By the time he saw the wet floor sign, some 10 or 12 feet away, was too late. And so this is a perfect example of somebody mopping the floor when they shouldn't be, exposing guests to a wet floor condition and not properly warning of that hazardous condition. Barricading large hazards, like you see here, goes a long way. If you have a big spill, somebody dropped a large drink and you can't get to it quickly, just surround it with a number of wet floor signs. Keep people out of the area until you can address it. The fifth and final step deals with employee footwear and employee training. Again, you can't require your guests to wear a particular shoe, but you can and should require that your workers be wearing slip-resistant footwear. And slip-resistant shoes soles of shoes actually have been clinically proven to cut slip and fall injuries claims in half. And again, this is a Liberty Mutual insurance study that showed under their analysis, their research, and they published their research in Occupational and Environmental Medicine. They found that slip-resistant shoes, by their workers wearing slip-resistant shoes, actually reduced the rate of slipping, slip and fall injuries, by more than half, by more than 50%. Many people will say, well, what makes a sole of a shoe slip resistant? And there's going to be an entire training program that I'm going to be giving on just that. What is a slip resistant walkway? And what is a slip resistant shoe? The easiest way to describe what constitutes a slip resistant sole is seen in this diagram. You have an interlocking pattern, a sole pattern where you have channels or grooves in the bottom of the sole that allow fluid to go through those channels once you step on it. So if you step on a wet floor, the water has somewhere to go, and it'll actually traverse through these channels of the sole and come out of the side of the sole. The sole needs to be flat. You don't want heels. You want a large rubber compound type of sole that's flat, that has a large surface area. You want an arch, a flat arch, again, for maximum contact. Again, the arch support inside the shoe to make it comfortable is important, especially for many people that have low arches, but the sole of the shoe should be flat. And again, these channels need to be about 2 millimeters in width. A lot of research behind that. In fact, the NFSI B101.7 shoe test or footwear sole test method spends a lot of time talking about performance of shoes. And if the company that you're buying your slip-resistant footwear from is not providing you test data as performed under the NFSI B101.7 standard, then you need to send the shoes in for testing. You need to know just how slip-resistant the sole of the shoes that you're specifying are. It might surprise you to know that prior to the B101.7 standard, which just came out a year ago, there was no test method that would determine or measure the slip resistance of a shoe as to conform with the definition of slip resistant. So although you've seen the term or the phrase slip resistant on the sole of shoes, it really was never supported by any independent test data. It was more like a marketing term, like new and improved. It demonstrated or claimed to demonstrate a certain performance issue like safety, but the manufacturers never really had a way of testing, nor did they label. But that's changed. Again, if you're looking at specifying slip-resistant shoes for your workers, ask the manufacturer if they've tested it to the NFSI B101.7 standard. If so, provide you the data. Again, it's a high, moderate, and low traction performance label. And if they haven't, send them into the NFSI for testing. The NFSI is an independent third-party testing laboratory that tests products of all types, from flooring, floor care products, equipment like auto scrubbers, the backings of floor mats, and shoes. In a recent National Safety Council Employer Perception Survey, it was revealed that 73% of workers believe safety is a priority. But 72% said that management showed that. In a recent National Safety Council Employer Perceptions Survey that was done a number of years ago, it was revealed that 73% of workers believe that safety is a priority at their workplace, and that 72% said that management showed that they actually do care meaning invest in safety. However, a third of the workers said that they were afraid to report a safety-related issue because of fear that they might get fired. They may lose their job. And the other component deals with that bosses put speed, workers' rate of speed, over safety. And so it's more important, again, this is a perception survey, that we get the job done quickly, not necessarily safely. And that's troubling, because if a third of your workers think that you're not prioritizing safety specifically as relates to their job performance, then chances are something is going to happen. And training your employees is critically important. Many of the folks that are working for you today are either millennials or Gen Zs. These are younger people. And their view of the world is a bit different than the baby boomers or the Gen Xs. The term my way, right way, why pay is oftentimes a phrase that I've heard from a number of large food restaurant chains. And in fact, a friend of mine, Scott Gross, wrote a book called Millennial Rules, and it discusses how millennials see the world and how you can teach them, how they learn. Millennials, again, want the world to be the way they want it. And so, political issues such as global warming play a very big role in younger people, more so than older people. That's not necessarily a political view, but it's a fact. Younger people see our society very differently than older people. And so what we found and what the book speaks to is, in lieu of, providing a CDR, a video training program, or written documents on safety, instead of providing old school ways of teaching techniques, millennials and Gen Zs would much rather learn by way of a short YouTube video. Make it important, make it simple, and it's one that they can watch repeatedly and it'll sink in. But if you want to, set a millennial or a Gen Z down in front of a television screen and watch a CD-ROM training or a video training, if you go back into the day, chances are they're not going to get a lot from it because they learn differently, they think differently. And again, we see that everywhere. Post-COVID, where a lot of data has been collected about distance learning and how people learn differently from an online program versus an in-person program. And so keep that in mind. Secondly, they take technology for granted. They live in the world of social media. And so you need to understand that, first of all. And they think of the world in terms of instantaneous results. I see it, I want it, let's get it done now, and they're on to the next issue. We see that with all social media, whether it's Facebook, TikTok, for example, Snapchat. Social media plays a very big role in younger workers' lives. And so use that to your benefit. Develop training programs and techniques that really utilize that technology to help your people learn what you want them to learn. Lastly, Millennial Rules talks about the heightened level of social responsibility. Most millennials and Gen Zs find themselves really far more concerned about things than older people do in terms of our society. And so play into that. That's important for you to know. Understand that that's a value. And if you understand that, it pays big dividends. Most younger people take safety very, very seriously. They want things to be safer. They want to protect themselves and their coworkers. They just don't know how. And so keep it simple. Present information to them in a format that they're comfortable in learning from. Repeat it so they absorb it. Make it easy for them to access whenever they want. If an employee wants to watch a YouTube video that you put out for the company at 1 o'clock in the morning because they're up at that hour, make it easy for them to acquire it. And if you do that, you're going to find that they're going to learn more. And with that, kind of brings a close to this program. 5 easy steps in preventing slips, trips, and falls. And so if you connect yourself, first of all, to the people you're training, if you connect yourself to the problems you have, whether it be flooring, floor maintenance, floor matting, footwear, if you connect yourself to solutions, you're going to find yourself disconnecting yourself from problems. Because those people, those industries, those companies that have a high rate of slips, trips, and falls are generally disconnected. They see injury claims or lawsuits or premium increases as simply a cost of doing business. Sure, Russ, we have people slipping all the time. That's why we have insurance. Well, for those people, this presentation will probably fall on deaf ears, but I'm hoping it won't for you. And with that, this has been Russ Kenzior coming to you from the National Floor Safety Institute, again, warning you to not let your next step be your last step. Until then, take care.